Hi. The question that I want to explore in this session is why did God create man, male and female? Another way to say this is what is the purpose of gender differentiation? Mark Cortez, in Theological Anthropology, A Guide for the Perplexed, he asks the question this way: what would a theological perspective on human sexuality look like? And I think Cortez's question is the same as my question. To understand human sexuality theologically is to understand what God thinks about human sexuality and to try to determine from Scripture what his intentions are for human sexuality. I see two basic approaches to this question. One approach is asking what the given fact of gender differentiation tells us about manhood and womanhood. That's one approach. You take gender differentiation as a given, and then you just try to expound on that and say, what does that mean for us now? Wayne Grudem takes this approach in his book, Biblical Foundations for Manhood and Womanhood. He sees that woman is created from man. He takes it as a given and concludes that the imago Dei in woman is derived from man. And then he tries to argue from this that man has headship over woman. This approach does not speculate on God's purpose in creating gender differentiated beings. The second approach that I see is asking our question: why did God create gender differentiated beings? Not just what does gender differentiation teach us about ourselves, but why did God do this in the first place? Was it necessary? If so, why? This approach acknowledges that God could have created man differently. It could have been different than it is now. This approach also, as a consequence of that, assumes that gender differentiation is not arbitrary. I here am concerned with this second approach because I think that this is what Mark Cortez is getting at in his book, Theological Anthropology. And this book is what sparked my thinking on this topic. So we're going to look at 5 modern theologians, and we're going to try to understand their approach to this question of what is the purpose of gender differentiation. And then we're going to evaluate each one and see if they satisfy what we're looking for. Real quick about the terminology. The language of gender differentiation is one that I'm choosing to use. By gender, I mean sex. I mean male, female. That will become obvious. Instead of using what Cortez uses, which is just sexuality. And I find that Cortez is unclear in some places. Is he talking about sexual drive, or is he talking about sex differentiation? Sometimes it's unclear. So for the sake of clarity, I'm just going to use the language of gender differentiation. But I think, I'm not sure what Cortez is doing, but I think we're all asking a very similar question. And this is my thesis, that of these 5 theologians, all of them except one are offering compelling arguments for why God made man with person differentiation, but their arguments are not compelling for why God made man with gender differentiation, except one. I think one is adequate. So just to clarify, this person differentiation is just a way of saying 2 different people. So all the persons in this class, for example, are male. There is no gender differentiation in this class, but there is person differentiation. And so the common line of argumentation for these theologians is that since man makes visible the invisible God, since we are the image of God, and since this God that we image is a community of sameness and difference, then man must be created in a community that has sameness and difference. The reason this is necessary is either because this is the only way that God could have made beings that partner with him, that's Karl Barth's view, or that this is the only way to adequately reflect God. And Barth would combine the two and say that we must reflect God in order to partner with him. In these arguments, however, the word difference applied to the Godhead is not a difference of gender. but a difference of persons. That's where I think a lot of this confusion enters in. Man must be made in a community of other persons so as to reflect the Godhead, sure, but this explanation does not tell us why these human persons must be gender differentiated. Grudem, however, in his systematic theology, does offer what I think is an adequate explanation. He says the Trinity is differentiated by persons, but how does one differentiate between those purposes? What is this standard for saying this person is not this person? He suggests that they are differentiated by role. So, if man makes visible the invisible role differentiation within the Godhead, then man must have a role differentiation that is clearly marked. In other words, a role differentiation that is visible. Grudem, of course, takes this in the direction of authority and submission, but as we'll see toward the end, I don't think that's the only option. I think there are other options out there, and I'm going to present one. Okay, so the theologians we're going to look at are Karl Barth, Emil Brunner, Paul Jewett, Wayne Grudem, and Mark Cortez. We're going to try to understand their arguments and try to evaluate them and see, are they making a compelling argument just for person differentiation, or are they actually telling us why gender differentiation is necessary? So let's look at Barth. And we'll just read a few quotes from him, and then we'll try to assess them. Here's the first quote. He willed the existence of a being which in all its non-deity, and therefore its differentiation, can be a real partner. So there we encounter the word differentiation in terms of man is different from God in that he's not God. He goes on about this non-deity, about man, which is capable of action and responsibility in relation to him. So there you have relation. To which his own divine form of life is not alien, which in a creaturely repetition as a copy and imitation can be a bearer of this form of life. So you see Barth's argument that man must be, in a sense, a copy of God in order to partner with him, because how could a creature partner with its creator unless it bears some form of life similar to the creator? So the creator creates the creation, there's your differentiation. But the creation is made in such a way that it bears a similar form of life to the creator, there's your relation. In other words, God wants a being that is enough like him to be partner with him. And to be like God, as Barth says, you have to have differentiation and relation. You have to have differentiation from God. Man is different from God, but also relation. The relation is God is man is a copy and imitation of God. But because God is a differentiation and relation within himself, man, in order to be a copy of that, must be a differentiation and relation within himself. So you enter, or so comes in this gender differentiation. Man is said to be male and female. There's your differentiation. But man is also referred to in the plural. Adam often carries the weight of male and female. Adam is just man. In Genesis 5, it says he made man in his likeness. Male and female he made them, and he called them Adam, man. I think that, we're going to move on to some other quotes. So here's another one. To be created good, man needs a being like him and yet different from him, so that in it he will recognize himself, but not only himself, since it is to him a thou as truly as he is an I. And the next quote. What is sought is a being resembling man, but different from him. If it were only like him, a repetition, a numerical multiplication, his solitariness would not be eliminated, so it would not confront him as another, but he would merely recognize himself in it. Now, I think Barth's argument is a good argument for person differentiation, that God could not make man in a solitary situation where man's only relation would be God. The human form of life had to be a copy of the divine form of life, Thus, it had to have person differentiation, the way that the Trinity has person differentiation. But I don't think that Barth's explanation demands gender differentiation. He says if the other is only like him, he says it is a repetition, a numerical multiplication, and his solitariness would not be eliminated, so it would not confront him as another, but he would merely recognize himself in it. I don't see why this has to be the case. My best friend, for example, is he just a repetition of me? No, he's not just a numerical multiplication of me. I am not solitary when I'm with him, and I do not recognize myself in him. I recognize my masculinity, or rather my maleness in him, but not myself in him. And if God had designed humanity with only males, and somehow those males were able to procreate together, I think that this scenario would still meet Barth's criteria. And so I don't think Barth has shown us why gender differentiation is necessary. Moving on to Emil Brunner. Brunner sees that one of the implications of being made in the image of God is a responsibility to God. The animals don't have a responsibility. God doesn't have responsibility. Only man in the image of God has this responsibility to its creator, because it is not just a creation, it is also a creation in the image of God. For this reason, he concludes, quote, "In the purpose of creation, man's existence consists, from the formal point of view, in existence for love, and from the material point of view, in existence in love. Thus, the distinctively human element as such does not appear in the individual, for existence in community is part of true humanity. Hence, from the outset, man has not been created as an isolated being, but as a twofold being, and not simply as two human beings, but as two beings who necessarily belong to one another, who have been created for this purpose, and whose whole nature is ordered in this direction, that is, as two beings who cannot be apart from each other." So Brunner is saying that man, made in the image of God, has responsibility to God, and that responsibility is one of love. So therefore, to love, he has to be in a community, and this means being created as two beings. So far, it's obvious that gender differentiation is not necessary for the existence of community. If God, for some reason, was able to create humanity in such a way that males could procreate with males, then for the propagation of this community, if God was limited, if God could not have created it such that males could procreate together, if that was an impossibility, then gender differentiation is necessary for the propagation of this community. But if God could have made it otherwise, then I see no reason why gender differentiation is necessary for community. He goes on to say, though, that it would not just have been two human beings, it would have been two beings who belong to each other. And what does Brunner mean by belong to one another? What Brunner is not saying here is why male and female belong to one another. He's just saying they do from the given facts. He's saying this is their nature, he says, and this is their whole nature is ordered in this direction. They've been created for this purpose, but he doesn't tell us the purpose of the male and female. He just said this is how it was done and draws some implications from there. So again, I see no explanation here of why gender differentiation is necessary. Moving on to Paul Jewett. We'll just read a couple quotes here quickly. "The dualism of male and female, then, is the will of the Creator for men in this world as an appropriate expression of man's creaturely dependence. Thus man has a reminder in the very form of his humanity as male and female that the true purpose of his life is community with God and his neighbor, and that his would-be self-sufficiency is the ultimate folly, a manifestation of pride, the root of all sin." Jewett's work in general in his book, Man as Male and Female, is directed toward the egalitarian view of church leadership. And I don't feel like he deals adequately with this question. So I think it's fairly obvious that gender differentiation is not necessary to feeling a sense of dependence and freeing us from pride. Person differentiation is necessary for that, I think. Now on to Grudem in his systematic theology. Grudem writes, if human beings are to reflect the character of God, then we would expect some similar differences in roles among human beings, even with respect to the most basic of all differences among human beings, the difference between male and female. And this is certainly what we find in the biblical text. So Grudem here is actually trying to say gender differentiation is necessary to reveal a heavenly reality, and that is differentiation in role within the Godhead. And I think Grudem does offer an adequate explanation of the necessity of gender differentiation. Let's go back briefly to our thought experiment of an all-male humanity. Obviously, if males could procreate with other males, maleness would not be exactly what it is in our experience now. But the point is that to be considered one gender means that all males would be capable of the same role. It would be impossible, for example, to have some males that can carry, deliver, and nurse a child, and some males that could not. Otherwise, they would be two different genders if that were the case. So in an all-male humanity, all would be equally capable of doing any of the roles. It could be that both males carry each other's child simultaneously, or one could stay home and nurse the child on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and the other on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And this is a bizarre thought experiment, but it is obvious that there could be no role differentiation concerning children without gender differentiation. Thus, Grudem, by pointing to roles within the Godhead, satisfies the necessity of gender differentiation. Like I said earlier, though, his conclusion of this is that the primary role differentiation is that the Father is in authority and the Son is in submission. And there are some problems with that view, and I don't think it is the only option. Now moving on to Cortez. Cortez is helpful in that he walks through several views, but he lands on this one, sexuality as bonding. And here are some quotes from Cortez. Our sexuality is fundamental to relationality because it is our sexuality that creates in us most fundamentally a need for the other that causes us to seek the fulfillment that comes only through our relationship with the other. Again, he writes, it was Adam's very sexuality that created in him a desperate need to find completion in another human person. Sexuality manifests a lack at the core of the human person that results in a persistent drive toward the human other in search of relationship and community. And finally, the mystery of our sexuality is the mystery of our need to reach out to embrace others both physically and spiritually. Sexuality thus expresses God's intention that we find our authentic humanness in relationship. I find Cortez to be unclear here in his handling of sexuality. At one moment, he seems to be talking about sexuality in terms of why God made us male and female. And at another moment, he seems to be talking about gender differentiation as a given, and then go on to say what we can learn from the given of gender differentiation. And I'm trying to be fair to Cortez while I don't really understand him. And to be fair, he has not posed the question the way that I have posed the question. But to be critical of him, I don't think he has posed the question clearly enough for us to know precisely what he's trying to say. With all that said, I don't see why the need for another could only be met by a gender differentiated other. And perhaps that's not the question that Cortez is interested in, but at times he does give the impression, I think, that he is interested in that, but then he does not answer that adequately. So to repeat, I don't see why that primal need for another can only be met by a gender differentiated other. I don't think he explains that. So now that we've finished with our survey of the theologians, I conclude that Grudem is the only one who actually offers an explanation of why God created man with gender differentiation. And that is this: gender differentiation is the visible manifestation of a role differentiation that exists in the Godhead and that God intends to exist in humanity so that we might more adequately represent him. But I want to offer an alternative way of looking at this role differentiation than the one that Grudem offers, which is one of authority and submission. And this alternative is roughly from an Eastern Orthodox theologian named Paul Evdokimov, by way of another Eastern Orthodox theologian, Edith Humphrey. I could not access Evdokimov's book in time for this, but through Edith Humphrey, I was able to get a gist of it and add a little bit of my own. It'll give you a flavor of this idea, enough to evaluate it. The argument here is not that not that there is gender differentiation in the Trinity. The argument is that there is some dynamic within the Trinity, and this dynamic marks a real difference between the persons, and God, in making man, wants to create a picture of that difference that really exists in the Godhead. He wants to create an image of it. So he creates humanity with this dynamic and makes it a visible reality in us through a division of roles in mankind, specifically a division of roles in creation and procreation. Or in the Godhead, a division of roles in creation and the new creation, which is imaged in mankind by our different roles in creation. And what I mean by creation from a human perspective is procreation. We are called into the ongoing task of filling the earth, that further act of creation. So if we say that there is masculinity and femininity in the Godhead, we cannot mean that there is male and female in the Godhead. Male and female are merely images of masculinity and femininity that exist within the Godhead. And we're not talking about masculine and feminine dispositions or characteristics like aggression or gentleness, but rather simply masculine and feminine roles in creation that are imaged in the male and female roles in procreation. Evdokimov's argument is that the masculine role in creation is the Son, and the feminine role in creation is the Spirit. The Father is a mystery, and he is revealed in creation through the agency of the Son and the Spirit. And this is true of the new creation as well. And mankind, having been called into this task of ongoing creation through procreation, images this Son-Spirit dynamic. And so here is a rough sketch of how this argument might work. In creation, the Son is sent out as the Word of God to initiate the creation process by bringing into existence that which did not exist. The Spirit in creation, however, hovers over the water like a mother broods over her young. And if we look to Proverbs 8, this might help us spell this out. And the Eastern Orthodox have a rich tradition of finding femininity in the Godhead. But Proverbs 8 personifies wisdom as a female who is present with God at creation but not creating. Whereas John 1 and Colossians 1 view the Son as the one who created all things. And then in the new creation, we see that for the sake of the new creation, the Son lays down his life, just like in Ephesians 5, Paul tells men to love their wives like Christ loved the church, laying his life down for her. And we also see that in the new creation, the Son reigns as the head over the new creation, which may go back to 1 Corinthians 11, which, where man is the head of woman, Christ is the head of the church. And then in the new creation, the Spirit leads this creation, the old creation, into the new birth of the new creation. And the Spirit remains with the new creation, stays with them, nurturing them, and directing them to follow the Son. So that's the view in a nutshell, and I think it will be fruitful for discussion. I want to point out some quick strengths and weaknesses of this view, and then we'll be done. One of the strengths of this view is that it frees the understanding of gender differentiation from the limited scope of marriage. This explanation actually runs much deeper than marriage, and it actually is helpful in explaining what marriage is. So even single people can find meaning in their gender without being married. And I think we need to clarify something here. I'm not saying that single people find meaning in their gender by being told how to be their gender. I don't think this view demands that we say, well, since the female images the spirit's role in creation of brooding and of nurturing and of pointing to the son, that all women in every relationship need to be nurturing. I don't think that that's the point. I think this view simply says that gender is a visible manifestation of the differing roles in creation and recreation within the Godhead. So we learn about him from these gender differentiations. I don't know that this view helps us learn about us as much, and maybe that's the point. Another strength is that if this view is free from the limited scope of marriage, then it makes sense of gender in the resurrected state. Some images in Scripture, some images are shadows of future heavenly realities, and some are shadows of eternal heavenly realities. I find this distinction helpful. Marriage is an image of a future heavenly reality, the complete union of God and his people. And therefore, in the resurrection is no longer necessary because it will be fulfilled. But gender differentiation, if this argument is on the right track, is a shadow of the eternal role differentiation within the Godhead. As such, our gender can no more disappear in the resurrection than can the imago Dei. Another strength of this is that it does not require us to argue for the subordination of the Son to the Father, which is problematic. Some weaknesses of this view: it's obviously very speculative, and what I mean by that is it lacks clear biblical support. Although there's enough there, I think, to get a discussion going, I'm not sure there's enough there to seal the deal. Another weakness is that it claims to see something in the immanent Trinity, see something of the immanent Trinity, rather, in the image of God in man. And I'm not certain that that is an appropriate endeavor. Fred Sanders, for example, argues the economic Trinity, and only the economic Trinity, is the image of the immanent Trinity. I don't know about that either, but if Fred Sanders says it, I think that's enough to give me pause and to evaluate that. Well, that's all I've got for this presentation. I look forward to our discussion in class.